Hi, good day. I saw some people asking a lot about how to move items on the screen. In our case, we're just going to move my favorite correct just by using inputs from the keyboard. This can be further extended to add input for pro pads, controller pads, those kind of things. But I'm just going to start with the keyboard, and we'll see how easy it is to actually implement movement. Well, as usual, just create a similar screen to what I have here. I have a normal Node 2D and a colorect as well. I'm going to be wiring this up to move the colorect. Let's start by adding script to the main Node 2D, and we'll just leave everything as is and create. Let me just start by adding a variable for speed, because remember, sometimes movement can be very slow. So I'm just going to add speed, and let's put it at int is equal to maybe 200. That should be good. I don't need a ready function in this case. Maybe yes, I can use a process function, although strictly speaking, when it comes to moving items in a game, we should use physics process, but I'll get to that later on maybe. Let me just create a function called move by key, and there's a reason I'm doing it this way, because there are several different ways you can move stuff, but I'm just going to start with move by key, which is basically using a similar approach to move by direct position that we did like in my first color video, back and forth video. I'll put a link to it for you to check out. But the best method of moving items on the screen, for example players or blocks or whatever you're using as your player or enemies, is better served by using input maps. It's much simpler, and it has built-in functions that assist movement and interactions like collisions with other objects. Let me start off with the age-old way of moving by just direct position. So let's just create a function. I'm just creating a function like this so I can separate it easily. Let's call it move by key, just to give it a descriptive name. And let's start off with if. We can use input. This is bad spelling as usual. We can use input. This is the accepted method and accepted built-in function to move items on the screen. In this case, we say if input dot is key pressed, and soon we'll add some information to this, but let me just control click input so we can get a little more information on input. Let me maximize the screen. So if we go down a bit here, you can see input is a whole class on its own, and it has many methods and functions that we can use. What we are going to use right now is right around here, is key pressed. When we use is key pressed, we need to add a key code, and this is basically what we're going to use here. So in our case, let's say we want to go left, so we're going to put is key pressed, and thank goodness for auto complete. We can put left and it comes up automatically. Don't forget, this is supposed to be a colon, not a semicolon. And we want to move, let's go back, minimize the screen. We want to move the colorect dot position. Remember, I said this is not the accepted way to move items on a screen. If you want to move it with input, that is. But I'm just doing this to show relatively how difficult it is to move items using this method. And remember, update the position by a vector 2. Vector 2 has built-in constants. We're using left here, so let's just type left. Left is basically vector 2, where the x value is -1 and the y value is 0. And let's just multiply it by speed, or we can just leave it as is for now. And let's save this and see what happens if we run this. Don't forget, first run is going to ask you what scene to use. So I just select the current. But if I press left, nothing happens. And that's because I forgot to wire it up to process. Up here in process, let's remove pass and just add in the move by key function that we just created. Now, this is supposed to show some movement. So again, up, down, right, left has some movement. Good. Let's just wire up the rest. I'm gonna copy, Control C and Control V, Control V, Control V to paste because I want to do right. And we'll change vector 2 to right. Next key will be up, UP, and it's not coming up. Let's just type it in. Key, let's go up. There it is. And this will be vector 2 up. And of course this one will be down. Key down and vector 2 down. Let's save this. Control S and let's run. Now if we press, we'll see movement. It's very slow. We can always upgrade that with speed. So we go back here, we go back and we multiply all movement by speed. Let's save and run. And that's way too quick, but it works. Okay, so even though, let's just change the speed to maybe 10 or 20 or something. Control save, let's try this out. Much better. Okay, so even though this works well, it's not widely accepted to move items on the screen like this unless it's just UI based or something that is not going to interact with other items on the screen. Since this is a game-based program, I'm pretty sure when you're going to use these concepts, you want some character or some player or some enemy or some object bouncing around, hitting other items, hitting walls, interacting with floors and so on. There are special built-in functions and methods that are used in cases like that. Let me just go back to input again. Remember we were looking at input. When we go down again in the input, there's just above the is action pressed, about 2 functions above that, there's one called vector 2. And this has something called get vector, which uses a negative x value, a positive x value, a negative y, positive y, and dead zone, which I'm not going to be using in this case. This greatly cuts down the amount of code that we have to use, but we have to implement something called an input map before we can use something like that. So let me just go back to here, and the input map is simple. We just go into project at the top left hand corner, project settings, and on the left hand side, just after the tab, just after general, just to the right of general on the top, we click input map, and in here we can actually define movement keys. So let's start. Let's add a new action. Let's say we want left. We type left and add. And let's do right. Let's do them all one time. Add right. Add up. And add down. Of course, you can call these forward and backward. Depends on what you like. You can actually put move left, move right, move up, move down, move forward, move back. The built-in dead zone is 0.02, but you can change these things. We're going to add a key. As soon as we click this, you'll see it's listening for input. Let's press for left. Let's press the left arrow button and click OK with the mouse. Let's do the same for right. Right button, up, forward button or up button, and down, the back button or down button. And of course, if you want to use WASD, you can also add that here by adding a next button. It's listening for input, and you just put W, type in W. A S D. So now we can use either the arrow buttons or the WASD. And of course you can configure this to whatever buttons you like. If you notice when you click the plus, there are also joypad buttons you can use here. If you have a joypad, you can map it to these buttons. Let's cancel this. There are also mouse buttons you can map to. So if it's just one movement or two movements, simple stuff, you can map it to left mouse click, right mouse click, those type of things, scrolling, those type of things. And there are also joypad axes. Let's just close this off and go back to the code screen. Let's add a couple spaces. And start the actual function to move by input map. So I'm just making separate functions, but this is not necessary. You can just delete that function that I got there and just remove it completely. But for reference, I'm leaving it there. Move by input map. In order for this input map to work properly, we need to add a new node to our screen. And that's because we are going to use something called a character body 2D and a function called move and slide. I'll explain more as we encounter them. Let's just start off by adding variable direction. Why did I type so? This variable direction. It's not necessary, but it makes life easier. And remember, when we were in the input documentation, we saw vector 2 has something called get vector, and negative x. We want the negative x, the positive x, and a negative y, and a positive y. So let's go back. In our case, we're just going to put the get input.get vector. Let's call vector. And as you can see, the properties that we added in the input map are showing up here. We call it left, we call it right, we call it up, we call it down. I should have given it other names so it's easier to figure it out. But if you go down, we'll see that those are the names that we have. That doesn't have the UI in front of it. The UI is built-in inputs that comes with the input map. Our first one is supposed to be negative x. which will be our left. If you remember Godot, Godot's left is in that direction. Our right will be our positive x, comma. Our up will be, I don't really want to scroll to the bottom. There it is. And our positive y is down. That zone is not necessary. It's already built in, but I'm going to leave it as is. We have a direction which just takes the input, gets a vector according to the built-in function getVector, and it returns a vector based on what buttons we are pressing, based on what buttons we set to press as left, right, up, and down. Remember I said we have to add new nodes. Let's click the main node and let's add something called a character body 2D. So this is a 2D screen, and let's just make the correct child of it. Character body is complaining that we don't have a collision shape on it, but we're not going to interact with other shapes or items like floors or walls in this tutorial. We're just going to move it around, so I'm just going to leave that as is for now. But ideally I could have drawn or put a rectangle collision shape to match the correct that I have here as seen on the 2D screen. But as I said, I'm not going to do that. Let's go back to the script. Okay, so we're going to access this character body 2D. Why? Because this character body 2D brings in new properties. Properties such as velocity, which is important when we're using the character body 2D. And velocity of an item is basically the direction by the speed. So we're just gonna, we already have direction here, which will give us the right, left, up or down direction. And we have speed at the top. But this does nothing as is. This just sets the velocity, but there's no actual movement. We can save this and I'll show you. Don't forget we use the move by input map at the top here, so let's remove this move by key. We're not going to use that anymore. Let's move by input map. And nothing happens, even though I'm pressing the arrows. That's because it just sets the velocity as a property, but it doesn't actually move the item. Let's just drag across the character body 2D again. And now there's a built-in function called move and slide. We can check the documentation on move and slide. And basically, move and slide detects collisions, and if there's a collision while moving your object, the body that you're moving will bounce off, slide along, or interact with another body that has a collision body on it. We're not going to add collision bodies here, but this makes it simple to move. Because if you notice, look at the difference in the amount of code we just wrote just to move this. So all we did was add a character body 2D, attach the correct to it, so that every time the character body 2D is affected, the correct is also affected. And we extracted the direction input using getVector, got a velocity, which is direction by speed, and then move the object. And that's as simple as it is. Let's save this and let's run. Now if you notice, it moves very slowly, but it moves. Let's just change up the speed. Change it back to 200. And let's try this again. There we go. Remember I was saying that it's better to use physics process. In our case, with our simple movement, we're just going to move this around the screen, the color corrector around the screen. There are no interactions, nothing like that. But ideally, when we're dealing with character bodies, there's a lot of physics involved with bouncing, sliding, movement, those sort of things. And it's recommended to use physics process instead of process. The physics calculations are done much more smoothly than process on its own. Process is updated every frame, which means you have to set your delta, but the game might be a little jumpy. Sometimes interactions might look a little jumpy, they may not match properly. Just switch to physics process when you have interactions, and everything will move much more smoothly because it has built-in physics and built-in delta, and it is calculated every 60 frames or so. So it's more consistent movements. Let's just try this again and move it. And this is lovely. Now remember, if you want to interact with other items, make sure those other items have collision bodies as well, or else this is just going to go right through it like it doesn't exist. So that's how we move an object using input. I hope this was informative and helped dispel any confusion for anyone out there who was getting difficulty on how to move objects using input keys. See you in the next one.